basically, running is very popular, as probably all you know, and it's getting more popular. Everybody learns to run as a child. It's a natural thing. It happens whether you like it or not. And it's a very inexpensive workout. Running, bang for your buck compared to joining a gym, compared to doing Zumba or aerobics classes or anything else. It's by far the cheapest option out there. You need a pair of running shoes and some reasonable running clothes, and the park is yours. Running is increasing in popularity by leaps and bounds. You can see it every year. It just goes up and up and up in terms of the number of people running both races as well as recreational runners out and about. The New York City Marathon has all ages. This is not just for young people. Unlike soccer players, which tend to be more in their teens and 20s, or basketball players, which tend to be younger runners, you can see the peak runners are really later in life. This doesn't project very well, but basically 30s and 40s, 50s and 60s, there's lots of people running later in life. So it's a very different kind of spectrum than what we see for a lot of competitive sports. And there's a lot of people, myself included, who at age 44 are running faster than they ran at age 24. So this is a sport that is not necessarily age dependent. So we'll talk about injury principles. So basically the concept is everybody wants to get from here at the beginning of a race, New York Marathon being one of them, and finish up here at the finish line, doing what these people are doing, which is walking nicely through the finish line. Some might say just kind of jogged it, some might say without ending up here. This is the medical tent at the New York City Marathon, and it looks pretty well controlled right here, but the reality is it's not too controlled. It's a big mess there because there are lots of people that get some type of injury during these races and need some sort of medical attention. Fortunately, most of it is not life-threatening, most of it is not serious, most of it is people who are tired and ice and everything else. But, we like to try to do what we can to try to stay out of this place, and we really want to stay out of here, which is pretty rare, but we want to try to stay safe as we run and as we train. So biomechanics of injuries, most running injuries are not traumatic, even in New York City with potholes and taxi cabs, and now the city bikers probably are going to be the biggest threat to runners around. Basically, these are not usually traumatic injuries that we see. Most of them are going to be overuse injuries. So running is a lot of force through the legs. That's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just a natural fact. And those cyclic forces over and over and over again tend to amplify problems, which we'll get to in a second. And that's where we get into some trouble with these repetitive injuries. So you can see the biomechanics. The forces across the leg are up to, in the running stage, when you're running up hills, running down hills, can be up to 10 times your body weight through the force through your legs, which can get pretty significant. Again, your body is adapted for this and it's natural, but these forces can get us into trouble too. So the principle that I tell people a lot about is that running doesn't usually cause many problems. What it does is it often amplifies problems that were already there. Tightnesses, weaknesses, ankles that twist a little bit, knees that are weak, lack of core strength, lack of hip strength, all those things get amplified throughout the course of training for races, whether they're short or long, and then those forces get concentrated in one area, and that's where things get into trouble. So that can be the knee, that can be the tibia bone, that can be a foot. All those things can add up. So that's kind of the principle that I think is important to recognize. So the main theory behind these running events that we do is that basically everybody has a threshold for which they can accomplish some level of running or other aggressive sports activities for which they're not going to develop an injury. That threshold, basically, if you break it, is where you get into trouble. So that's where we get into these overuse injuries. That can be measured in miles per week. It can be measured in pace, speed, lots of different variables involved. But in general, the amount that you do is sort of where this threshold is. So that can be modified by genetics. If you come from Kenya, you probably have better genetics for running than if you come from New York or elsewhere. Some people have high, some people have low. Just a fact of life. Age can make a difference too. As we get older, again at 44, I think my threshold is still pretty high because apparently I'm still doing okay. But age does have a factor, and eventually it will catch up with you, and someday it will catch me too. Hopefully not soon. Training. This is where we all see the improvements. So we all know that you can't just get out there and run a marathon. Your best friend, a week before the New York City Marathon that you've trained for all summer, can't just get out there and go run with you and say, I'm going to run 26 miles and everything's going to be okay if he or she is not a runner. We all know that you have to train basically to run these races. So the theory is that if you train to the level that's below this level of a threshold, and guess what happens? the threshold goes up. So that's the key, is as we train, the threshold goes up and up and up to allow us to run 26.2 miles at a nice fast clip. Now, the other concept is that when we have an injury, that threshold no longer stays where it was, all of a sudden it drops down. So if you were running 25 miles a week, you have a minor injury, take some time off. If you return to running 25 miles a week right afterwards, you can get into trouble. You have to back it off a little and let the threshold ramp back up again. Again, this ramp depends on the severity of the injury and depends on the amount of time that you had to take off, but it's an important concept to realize that when we're recovering from things, you can't always just jump back into exactly what you were doing. So again, the injury recovery is really dependent on you slowly ramping it back up again, and that's pace is not so easy to tell. The other problem is that nobody has a Nike watch with a threshold indicator on it. Nobody has a computer program that can plug in their age, their date of birth, their size, or whatever, and come up with exactly what their threshold is. It's all built on trial and error. It depends on your race experience, depends on what you've done in the past, depends on how you're feeling. So the art of running is to figure out what your threshold is and try to run below it. The other key is that the higher you run closer to your threshold, the better you improve. So of course, if you run 10 miles a week forever and that's something you're comfortable with, your threshold's never going to go up. So you can't run 26 miles. We all know you have to ramp it up slowly, and the closer you get to the threshold, the better. The problem is you don't want to break it. So that's kind of the key to training. So injury recovery, resting is obviously important. Rest is a relative term. It can be propping your feet up right here. It can be just bringing your activities down below that level of threshold. But sometimes it's necessary to just really cut it all out completely if necessary. Cross training, non-impact exercise, that kind of counts as rest in a lot of ways, depending on the injury, depending on where you are. You can do cross training, try to maintain your strength and conditioning, at the same time letting your body kind of heal itself up. So, runners like to run. That's what we like to do, and it's not easy to tell runners not to run, and we try not to do it if we don't have to, but there are some times when we have to tell people to do that. So as we go, we'll kind of come up with some of the few scenarios where that's sometimes necessary. So we'll talk about injury prevention. Essentially, the number one rule is don't overtrain. Again, it's not easy to tell how much overtraining is, but in general, there are some ideas that people have kind of thrown around. The 10% rule is something you hear thrown around a lot, which I think is not a bad place to start in terms of thinking about things. It's basically that your weekly mileage increase should not be any more than 10% each week as you kind of roll through things. Obviously, if you're starting off at 5 miles a week, that's kind of hard because then you're basically doing 5.5 miles, and that only brings you up to 5 the next week. So when you're starting off from scratch, it takes a little bit more time, and you have to violate that rule. But in the midst of marathon training, this is probably a reasonable rule for weekly mileage. As you get into the higher numbers, if you're running 30 miles a week, bumping it up to 33 miles a week is pretty much a reasonable thing to do. So again, it's relative, but that's something you'll see thrown around a lot. Building up leg strength is super important. It's kind of a weird thing. We're runners, so we like to run. Our legs get strong, quote unquote. The problem is running is very hamstring intensive. It's very calf muscle intensive. It doesn't really build strong quads very much. It doesn't really build strong IT bands. There's a lot of muscle groups that really just don't get hit very hard in running. And unfortunately, those imbalances can lead to trouble down the road. So if you look at most professional runners, these guys are running 120, 150 miles a week. They're also working out twice a week with a personal trainer minimum, and sometimes more. And most of what they're doing is core strengthening and leg strengthening. And it seems weird that you have to do leg strengthening if you're a marathon runner, but the truth is that's what keeps you safe and healthy. So it's something that a lot of people give up as they start to do more mileage. They stop doing any kind of strength training because they don't think they need it. But the truth is that's the perfect time to keep doing it because it keeps your legs strong and healthy. It also can make you faster too, which is another reason why the pros do it. Core strength, super important. Building up abdominal muscles, lower back muscles, hip muscles. Again, it's something that falls by the wayside, but lots of studies have shown that if you're running with weak core, you're not running efficiently, your muscles are not working well, and it definitely puts extra stress on your hips, it can put extra stress on your knees. All those things work down the chain and can catch up with you. You may get away with it if you just do run, but mixing in core strengthening is super important. Again, definitely a big focus for a lot of these professional guys as they train. Stretching, it's important, maybe not as important as some people think it is. Certainly calves and hamstrings I think are pretty critical, and those are two things that I really feel pretty strongly about in terms of my daily stretches before and after runs. But those are definitely good things to do. You know, some of these half-hour, 45-minute stretching routines that I think are advocated by some people I think are probably overkill. I think that doing some dynamic stretching is not a bad thing to do, which is something that I do twice a week with a trainer, working on trying to dynamically stretch out hamstrings and other muscles can be helpful too to mix in, but it's definitely something to keep in mind and something to add to sort of maintain on a weekly basis. Varying your terrain, including soft surfaces, I think is super important, especially once you get into some crazy mileage for these races. Mixing in dirt, mixing in crushed asphalt, mixing in some pavement. Getting a variety, I think, is very important. Your legs like variety. That's what they were designed to run on from day one. So mixing that in is good. You're running the race on pavement, so you need to spend some time on pavement. But at the same time, mixing in some soft surfaces definitely can be both protective as well as better training. If you do a 7:30 pace on dirt, then you're going to be running a 7:30 very comfortably on asphalt. Slower, faster. Treadmills, on the other hand, I'm not a huge fan of. They do have their role for training when things are raining out, when they're cold out, and they are useful, and I'm not going to say that I never use them. But for the most part, every step you take on a treadmill is exactly the same. That is not how human beings are really designed for. So I've seen lots of people get into trouble doing long distance running on treadmills. Treadmills are also a softer surface. They've got a bounce and spring to them. Again, not really a natural surface, not something that is going to be necessarily very helpful to run on. So it's fine to use some treadmills, but to do all your training on treadmills, I think is definitely asking for trouble. Rest days are important as a part of any schedule. I think that even the pro guys, for the most part, are doing some form of rest. I think for most of us running these races, even running them very competitively, you need to have at least a couple of days of rest. Running 7 days a week is just not smart. It's not something that is going to necessarily lead to a faster time, and it's definitely going to be a higher rate of injury. So it's important to get the miles in, but you're much better off getting in more miles on one given day and leaving a day for rest for most people. Well-fitted, updated, appropriate shoes. I have so many patients who come in, and I say, where do you get your running shoes? Oh, I got them from Foot Locker. They were on sale. They looked cute. They were pink, and I thought they were nice. That's not necessarily the right thing to do. Some people can get away with it, but most people benefit from going to a running store, getting on a treadmill with shoes, and telling the people which shoes what kind of event you're training for. People training for a marathon don't need the same shoes if they're training for a 10K. They don't need the same shoes if they're running a 10K necessarily. So there is a lot of variability in shoes, and going to a good running store and having somebody really give you some advice on shoes, I think, is helpful. New York City is chock full of a bunch of good running stores now, so there's definitely not an excuse for not having good shoes when it comes down to it. I guess going back to that, the other caveat, which I think I mentioned later on, is making sure that your shoes are up to date. What you don't want to do is let them start to get worn out and not update them. In general, running shoes, really for the most part, are much flatter on the outside for most people after a certain number of miles running, versus when they fall apart and start to have the soles peel off. By then the game is long gone, and by then you've already put a lot of extra stress on your legs. So most people who follow a marathon training program and do this routinely are going to pick an interval and update their shoes. So once at the beginning of marathon training, once towards the middle, and once right before the race, depending on the level of miles you do. Other injury prevention, hydrating while during runs. It's important not to get dehydrated because you don't want to get sick and in the ER with an IV in your arm, but it's also important because your muscles need hydration in order to maintain their resilience. They need fluid, they need water. When you get super dehydrated, your muscles start to cramp. That cramping process can create some destruction of tendons and muscle fibers. Definitely going to be a higher rate of injury in patients in runners who are running dehydrated. So important during your training to stay hydrated, not just because it's a safe thing to do, but because your muscles need it too. Good nutrition, calcium and vitamin D. Definitely a good thing to do is to look at your nutrition as you go along. As you start to advance your mileage, it's important to add more calories throughout the day. I have a very regimented eating habit. I eat breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but during marathon training, when I'm starting to ramp up the miles, I add in a snack during the midday, I add in a snack in the afternoon, and usually before I go to bed, add something in. Really try to maintain my calories so that I'm sort of keeping them going up and up and up as my miles up and up. I watch my weight very carefully, make sure that it's not dropping off, because that's a sign that definitely you're ending up in trouble, basically. Here's more appropriate calories. Again, important to make sure that you watch that as you go along. And once again, keeping your weight. Some weight loss is okay. In your marathon training, you're going to lose some weight. It needs to be carefully controlled. You need to watch what it is, have some sort of a plan, look at what your sort of natural weight should be, and make sure that you're not going down below that too aggressively. So now we'll just run through again, just real quick specific injuries, things you hear people talk about, things you hear friends talk about who've been injured. Stress fractures, that's the evil of all runners, the enemy of all of us out there. The stress fractures are conceptually a failure of bone turnover. And the concept is bone is constantly being destroyed and rebuilt. So this is a nice sort of photomicrograph of bone. And what happens is as you go along, basically it is building bone mass. Your bone is breaking and healing. And that healing process remodels it and turns the bone trabeculi stronger. That's important to have happen. Astronauts, when they go into outer space, get on these treadmills. They don't do that because they want to fit in a swimsuit when they get home. They don't want to do it because it looks cool on TV. They do it because they want to maintain their bone mass. And if they're going to be on the space station for months at a time, they're going to lose significant amounts of bone mass, which can be very dangerous. So that's where all these things exist. It's gravity that's helping us on a day-to-day basis. And as runners, we're really using gravity, like a lot more of it. So when formation falls behind destruction, that's where we get into trouble. So this is a stress fracture, a crack through those bone trabeculi, which you can't really tell very well, but if you see this is very disordered looking, it doesn't look nice and regular like the other one did, and that's because this bone really is not strong enough because it just basically has lost some of that remodeling. So the bone doesn't heal itself fast enough, it's eventually going to break. And the analogy that I use for patients who are having a hard time figuring out what we're talking about is paper clips. Basically, you can't break a paper clip if you just try. It's not going to work. But if you bend it back and forth over and over again, eventually it'll pop into two pieces. And that's what a stress fracture is. The key to stress fractures is that our bone has a capacity to heal itself where a paper clip doesn't. Therefore, we can avoid this by being careful about what we do, unlike a paper clip, which is always going to break if you keep applying force. So, who's more at risk? Well, women definitely have an increased risk of it, especially women who are missing their periods along the way. Poor nutrition, anybody who has eating disorders definitely has a much higher rate, and anyone with osteoporosis can have some increased risk. So these are things that we should keep an eye on for runners that may be at risk for stress fractures. Where can we get them? Pretty much anywhere in the lower extremities. Don't see a lot of upper extremity stress fractures since we're pretty much using our legs, but pelvis, hip, knee, ankle, foot, those are the common sources, but pretty much anywhere from top to bottom we can see these. This is a tibial stress fracture. You can see this sort of line running across there on an MRI scan. It's a pretty common place for them. Foot stress fracture is very common in runners. Obviously a lot of force going through the feet as we go along. All this white stuff over there is swelling of the bone, which is abnormal and indicates a bone that's just about to break. The hip. Now, I bring up the hip because it's super important. The hip is a very high stress area. It's sort of a weird bone. If you see it makes sort of a strong angle right there, which is unique for bones in the body. Most bones are pretty much linear and follow the direction of the forces applied to them. This bone, unfortunately, has this very high stress area in the middle here, and when it gets into trouble, it's not very good. Basically, this is one of the few bones that really has a high risk of completing to a full fracture, and that is a catastrophic injury. This is where we turn into bad stuff. So a runner that lets a stress fracture, the hip complete is basically going to need something like this, basically big operation, plates and screws, got to put it back together again. That's not bad enough. There is a risk that the bone will die because it loses its blood supply when that happens, and then you need a total hip replacement. And for a 22-year-old young girl who's a runner, that's a bad thing. That's a catastrophic thing. So this is the one stress fracture that we really don't mess around with. Almost every other stress fracture, even if it cracks, it's not a big deal. You stop running, you go on crutches for a few weeks, and everything heals up okay. But the hip is the one we don't mess around with, so that's something we'll talk about a little bit as we go along. Treatment. Most stress fractures heal with rest. Their risk of completion to full fracture is low, and even if it happens, it's usually not a big deal except for hips. And most stress fractures are going to heal within about 3 months of no running, some a little faster, some a little slower, but that's kind of a general idea. But unfortunately, this is one of the few deal breakers for the marathon, and that unfortunately every year I see people coming in a week before the race, 2 weeks before the race. I send them for an MRI scan because they've got a history and an exam that looks kind of fishy. And I call them back and tell them I'm very sorry, but this is the one thing that is going to keep you from running because you cannot run 26 miles on a stress fracture and expect to have good results from that. So that is one of the few deal breakers for marathon training, either early or late in the game. And this typically does occur later in the game, but I've seen people who develop stress fractures after 2 weeks, 3 weeks of training, so it can happen early on too if you're really, not careful about getting started. So other common overuse injuries besides stress fractures, patellofemoral pain syndrome or runner's knee or chondromalacia patella is another word for it. You'll hear people throw around. It's basically a patella or a kneecap maltracking. The kneecap, which you can see kind of on that diagram up there on the CAT scan, is shifted to the side. It's not putting good pressure, and that can create this pain in the knee. Pain in the front of the knee, it's like an aching soreness. Going downstairs, sitting in a car with a knee bent for a while can definitely hurt. And going running downhill typically is where you're going to feel this most. Iliotibial band syndrome, another common knee injury. This one's on the outside of the knee, so this is something you're going to feel kind of on the outside over here. It's more of a tightness and a tenderness on the outside of there. It's sort of a friction syndrome where the muscle of the IT band rubs up and back, up and down. Because it's too tight, it creates friction. The friction creates inflammation, which creates pain, which creates more tightness, which creates more inflammation, and gets you into a cycle that sometimes is not easy to escape from. So another common knee injury that you're going to hear people talking about a lot. Knee arthritis. So everybody wants to know, does running cause arthritis? My mom calls me 10 times a year to tell me that I shouldn't be running marathons because my knees are going to be destroyed and I'm never going to walk again. But the truth of the matter is, no. There is no association with running and premature arthritis. There have been lots of studies looking at this, trying to come up with some sort of interaction, some sort of relation, but there's not. They did a bunch of studies where they looked at MRI scans before and after marathons. Really didn't see anything damaging to the cartilage. Nothing that was changed. So lots of studies looking to see whether this exists. Now, the reason why it can get a little bit confusing is that running is still not recommended for patients who have knee arthritis. So you take a patient here who's got this sort of wear and tear pattern on their joint right there. Running is going to increase their symptoms. Running is going to make their pain worse. It may be linked to progression of the arthritis, but even that is not proven. It's sort of assumed but not proven. But these are people that benefit from non-impact conditioning. So biking, swimming, elliptical, those are things that are better for arthritic knees. Unfortunately, running is not really very well suited for arthritic knees. Now, that's not to say that every patient who's got any arthritis can't run. Patients with mild arthritis sometimes just need some mild treatment to kind of keep them going. But for the most part, that's where things get confusing. So I will tell patients that I don't think running is for them if they already have arthritis, not because I think they're going to develop arthritis because of the running, which I don't believe is the case. Moving down the road, so we're going to keep going south. Shin splints, or what we call medial tibial stress syndrome, which is lower. It happens on the inner leg, so this is pain right on the shin here. Some continuity with stress fractures, so it's sometimes hard to tell the difference. But this is kind of an aching pain right on the lower leg there. It's inflammation, so it's a little hard to tell from this MRI, but this MRI has lots of swelling, lots of fluid on the outside of the bone, but the bone itself is pristine. It's nice and dark and black. So that's what we see with a shin splint type pattern and not a stress fracture. MRI scan oftentimes is very helpful for differentiating these two. This is a runner who I would say is not going to need to stop running quickly. And definitely since a week before the race, we try lots of things to try to get them through the race rather than telling them not to run. So shin splints are usually pain is mild during running, but after running is when it really hurts. So you run, it's sort of a little sore, it warms up, and then by the end of the run, you're starting to feel a little bit, and then you stop, and that afternoon it's really sore, and the next day you wake up in the morning and you think, oh my gosh, I can't believe I can't walk. That's a little more typical for shin splints. Stress fracture on the hand is typically more painful during running, so after mile 1 it starts to ache a little bit, after mile 10, wow, I can't believe this thing is really hurting, I think it's time to quit. Plantar fasciitis, foot problems. Everybody is going to hear about this one. It's a pretty common one that people talk about, and can develop from a number of different causes. But basically, it's heel pain. It's tightness of the heel cord back there. Very common in runners, common in non-runners too. But it becomes better during the run. A lot of times, it'll sort of loosen up a bit, and definitely worse in the mornings. It's that first step up out of bed in the morning that plantar fasciitis patients complain about. I get up out of bed and wow, I can't even get to the bathroom. By the time I eat breakfast, it's starting to feel better, but boy, it's pretty rough. So that's a common foot problem we see. Achilles problems, very common. Remember, all of our propulsion is coming from our hamstring and our calf. That's where most of what's pushing us forward. So the hamstring and the calf are common sites for overuse injuries, and that would be basically calf tendonitis, hamstring tendonitis, and Achilles tendonitis, where the muscle meets down the bone there is very common back there. You get pain in the lower calf. Also tends to stretch out during the run for the most part, and then sort of feel worse afterwards. Blisters, very common in runners, sometimes unavoidable. You can guess whose foot that is. It's basically poor fitting running shoes can do it. Size too large, size too small. It's sometimes unavoidable. There's definitely doing long distance races. At one point in time, most of us are going to end up with something. Ways to avoid it: Vaseline. I waft my feet up with Vaseline before every long run and before every race, for sure, marathons for sure. Double wool running socks I use too, which I think are pretty helpful. And again, finding that right mix of proper size shoes, which is not so easy, can be helpful. Subungual hematoma, basically when the nails start to get black and fall off, very common. It's another part of sort of common thing we see in running. It's not malignant, it's not dangerous, it's not life-threatening, and it's not going to basically destroy the toes forever. But unfortunately, if you run long enough, a lot of times you're going to get toe issues like this. One point is just leave the toenails in place. Eventually, they will start to sort of get loose and fall off, which is gross, but it's not dangerous or scary, and it doesn't affect the toe in the long run. So now again, recovering from injuries. These are techniques we use to recover from injury. Basically, ice and cold packs. Ice is nature's best anti-inflammatory. It reduces blood flow to the area, which is the body's bringing in all this inflammation, usually too much. So by reducing blood flow, you basically got rid of some inflammation, got rid of some pain, swelling, all the kind of things that we know are going to make the body more sore afterwards. Cold plunges. A lot of people use them. I typically use kind of a cold shower after I do a long run, but some guys will actually sit in an ice bath and really chill out their legs. I've never been able to do that. I did go to a spa once and had a cold thing you could walk into where you could stand right here in a cold thing. That was awesome, but it's kind of hard to put that in a Manhattan apartment. So I've never used one of those except for there. But definitely it can be helpful to do some icing or areas that are uncomfortable. Medications, anti-inflammatories we all know about. Aleve, Advil, Celebrex. This is a specific treatment. It's what we use to try to diminish that body's over-exuberant inflammatory response to a lot of the injuries that we develop. And it can be helpful not just to sort of prevent pain. It's not like taking a Vicodin or an oxycodone. It's taking something that can cool down the inflammation, which can help both heal the problem as well as make you feel a bit better. There are topical versions of this. Flector patch and Voltaren gel are two different things that we use. They're by prescription. Very good for superficial issues, so like an Achilles tendonitis tends to respond well. A kneecap tendonitis, IT band seems to do okay with this stuff too. Doesn't work as great for deep problems, so a hamstring problem doesn't work as well for, but it's another thing to try. Again, trying to cool things down to get you back to running again. Physical therapy, really important part of a lot of these running injuries that we develop. There are things that they can do locally, stretching and massage. They can do things with you or to you, like ultrasound and laser. They can do things with you, like strengthening. And then a really good physical therapist is going to look at how you run. It's going to check. They're going to see where you are in terms of your gait. They're going to see what body parts are tight and weak. They're going to check your hamstrings. They're going to check your hips. I have patients come back to me all the time. They're like, you sent me for my ankle, but they spent the first 2 visits looking at my hips and my legs. Overall, I'm not sure that I'm really doing the right thing. And they say, stick with it. And then 2 or 3 weeks later, they come back and they say, you know what? It's really working. Everything's coming together. I never knew that my hamstrings were that tight. I never knew that I had so much weak core muscles, or that my hip muscles were crazy weak. And after 2 weeks of strengthening, things are starting to come together. Cortisone, something we use pretty commonly. Basically, it's a very strong localized anti-inflammatory. It is sort of like taking a bottle of Motrin and putting it right in one specific spot. It doesn't work for everything. It works well for things that are very localized. IT band syndrome, plantar fasciitis, certain tendon disorders seem to be very effective for. We use it sparingly. We don't use it over and over again, but basically it is another thing we use on top of therapy and oral stuff and such to try to get runners running again. And depending on the disorder, it can be pretty helpful. There's another entity which you'll hear about. It's called platelet-rich plasma, or PRP. It's kind of experimental. We're using it a bit here and there, and I do use it more during marathon season when people are really looking to try everything under the sun. It's kind of simple. You take blood out of the arm, put it into centrifuge, spin it down so just the platelets come out, and then inject those into an area that you need to put them in. Basically, platelets have very rich growth factors, which can be helpful in accelerating healing. The plus side to it is it's natural. It's your own stuff. It's not anything that comes from anywhere else. It's not synthetic. It's not cortisone. On the downside to it, it's unproven. There's a lot of studies showing that it doesn't work for certain things, or some minimal studies that show that it does. So it's sort of a you try it if you want to kind of thing, but it definitely has some good results for a lot of patients for different things, and some poor results too. The other big downside too is insurance doesn't cover it, so it's kind of on the expensive side. But it's out there as another option. You may hear it thrown about. So just to finish up, basically running is supposed to be somewhat painful. It's natural. I mean, it's not supposed to be a smile on your face, you know, grinning ear to ear kind of an activity if you're doing it at a level that's reasonably competitive for you or anybody else. It's not always easy to tell when to stop training. Sometimes soreness is natural and doesn't necessarily mean you gotta quit. Aches in general, things that are just kind of sore. It's going to be something that's it's poorly localized, it's not really tender. It's, yeah, my hamstring's kind of tight and sore, but it doesn't really hurt to push on it, and it doesn't hurt in one specific spot. Discomfort that improves during a run, so if you're sore and achy at the beginning, but then as you go it seems to warm up, that generally speaking is an ache rather than an injury. Tightness after a run is pretty much natural, and that's not necessarily something that can be avoided. Injuries, on the other hand, pain in a very small area tender to touch, typically speaking, is going to represent some type of inflammation that is getting localized, which oftentimes can sort of snowball and get stuck with you. Symptoms get worse with distance, so again, stress fractures as you run longer, they're going to hurt more, so that's something that's kind of a warning sign. If it hurts a little bit at mile 1, but at mile 10 you're really limping, that's a bad sign. And pain that affects walking after a run is really significant, so if you're really limping the afternoon after a run or the day after a run, that's different than just sort of feeling being tight and stiff. So once again, overtraining is definitely still the #1 cause of injury. So unfortunately, overtraining is very relative to who you are and what your condition is. Recovery is dependent on a gradual return to running, and sometimes stopping running for some period of time. And take hip pain seriously. So that's again one of the few conditions that, as an orthopedic surgeon, I routinely MRI people for just to be 100% safe. I don't think they got a hip stress fracture. It doesn't sound like it, but to play it safe, we oftentimes send people for scans because the consequences of missing something like that can be catastrophic. And sometimes it's not that easy to tell. Sometimes a little achy pain right here can be the very beginnings of an early stress fracture. It's not one of these sort of easy diagnoses that's 100% accurate every time. So that's it.
He knows what he's talking about. And as I was listening, it made me feel good because a lot of our training is like right simpatico with what he was talking about. The stretching, the taking it slowly, the gradual progression into your long runs. So we're going to open it up for question and answer, but please keep them generic in general, not like, could you diagnose my shoulder? Because we'll be here all night. So who has a question?
Yep.
Ira.
How would you do a heel spur?
I'm sorry?
A heel spur?
Well, heel spur is sort of the layman's term for plantar fasciitis. It's what people call, it's what people just call plantar fasciitis. The truth is that a lot of people have a little bony outgrowth on the bottom of their heel, which is, quote, a heel spur. That's not really necessarily associated with plantar fasciitis and the pain that comes with that. There are some podiatrists that get aggressive and cut those heel spurs out. That's not generally recommended. It's not something that's a conventional treatment. And it's usually not a pathologic issue. So, mostly if you hear people talking about heel spurs, it's kind of an older, sort of a more generic term for, or layman's term for plantar fasciitis, which is what most people call it.
Does rolling your foot around on a golf ball help for that, or?
Specific treatments for plantar fasciitis, stretching very good. Plantar fasciitis oftentimes represents the tightness of the entire mechanism back here. So it's not just the heel that's the problem, it's the calf that's too tight, the Achilles tendon is a little bit too tight, and that just works its way down the line. So anything that stretches it out, including very simple running stretches, can be both effective in treatment as well as prevention, which is again one of the reasons why I think that calf stretches are one of the things that are very important for runners. It's one of the few things that I think I'm pretty religious about. In the morning, as soon as I get up out of bed, I do some stretches in the shower. If I'm going for a run, I spend a couple minutes stretching out my hamstring and calves right beforehand. And then during the week, I try to spend some time doing it independently, in times when I'm at the gym doing other stuff. But there are other treatments you can do for it. Rolling golf balls, they make some rolling pins and foam rollers and things you can use. Can be effective. It's not probably that helpful. Foam rolling your calf can definitely be helpful. A lot of therapists will do that. Night splints, if you're having a lot of problems in the morning, they make a device that sort of pushes your foot up like this and just keeps it like this at night, so when you wake up, it's all stretched out. That can be very helpful. Physical therapy, doing a lot of deep tissue work to both the calf and the bottom of the foot can be helpful for that too. Cortisone shots, other kinds of medications helpful too. Yep.
Yeah, hi, you mentioned that you do a lot of stretching kind of throughout the day. What is your view on stretching? Because some people say, you shouldn't really stretch too much before you run, or,
My feeling on it is number one, I do think that the warm-up is more important than the stretching. So I do think that, what I do is, I live a half mile from the park, so I take a very light, leisurely run to the park, just take it nice and slow and easy. And when I get to the park, if I'm setting a pace that I wanna do for my runs, I start off slower than that for usually the first mile or so. So I've got a good mile and a half of something that's reasonably slow, depending on the size of the workout and everything else. And then I'll work up to speed and work up into hills and things like that. So I think that the warm-up, to me, is more important than the stretching before a run. I do some very, probably, I'd say maybe 5 minutes worth of hamstring and calf stretches. A lot of it's waiting for my elevator to come down. Some of it is just waking up in the morning, and while I'm brushing my teeth, I'll kind of just start stretching out the calf, or waiting for my running buddy to meet me in the park is when I'll do it. So, I'm reasonably religious about doing it, but I don't set limits on it. I've got to do this for 2 minutes and 5 minutes and whatever. What I do is twice a week I work out at the gym, and I do a lot of dynamic hamstring stretches, a lot of bringing the hip over, a lot of twisting and turning kind of dynamic stuff twice a week to really try to loosen up my hamstrings during a time that I'm not going to be running. I'm not going to sort of be beating them up. And I think working that in a couple of times during the week independently is a pretty nice thing to do. It's again, sort of learning from the pros. I go to these races, so I get the advantage. I get to watch the pros before they warm up after these races, and surprisingly, they don't look so different than us. But for the most part, they do all kinds of crazy dynamic stretches. They have these, like ropes and things that they use to just sort of bring their hips back and forth. They do a lot of like walking lunges and things to try to really sort of stretch things out. Some of them do these sort of like crazy hops where they're bringing their leg up and up and up. So a lot of these guys do a lot of these dynamic stretches before races, but they also work them into their weekly runs too. The truth is, all of us have limited time period. If you're a professional marathon runner, you can warm up for a half an hour doing lots of dynamic stretching and all kinds of crazy hopping and running backwards and things. For most of us, for me, adding, I'm running during peak marathon training 6 days a week, so doing an extra half an hour worth of stretching is a whole lot of extra time during my week that I don't have. So, some of that is, I think, good, but some of it's not that necessary. But I do try to get the same thing after a run. I try to get home and try to do some stretching, get in the shower, and really try to stretch out my calves, stretch out my hamstrings. It's a pretty good time to do it.
If someone's experiencing hip discomfort but not necessarily pain, would you recommend to seek physical therapy immediately, or
No, I think hip discomfort also is pretty variable. After I do a 20-mile run, if I get in the car and drive for a couple hours, my hip is in the back, my butt is always sore, it's tight, it's definitely achy, I'm squirmy. That's natural. It's just part of the running process. Pains that you want to watch out for in a hip are going to be deep groin pain is definitely a big sort of no-no. Pain that is not localized, you can't touch. So if you've got soreness associated with the pain, that's usually a pretty good sign. That means it's more likely to be just some sort of a mild tendonitis. It's that deep-seated aching pain that's kind of bad, and pain with weight bearing. So if you step down, at every step you feel this sharp kind of pain going deep in there, those are all stress fracture signs, which mean that it's time to get an MRI scan ASAP, get to see a doctor who can set that up for you, can examine you. I don't MRI every single person that walks in my door that has hip pain if they're a runner, but I'm a lot more cavalier about ordering it, especially for somebody who's doing marathon training, than I would be for other body parts that I don't think are at such a risk or that dangerous if it happens. So not every hip pain is scary and not every hip pain is dangerous, but it's just good to be at least a little bit mildly paranoid about it.
What's your opinion of toe shoes and the zero drop shoes?
All the different shoes out there. Somebody asks that every time, and I should put a slide in there just to address it. There are so many crazy shoes out there now. The Vibram 5 sole shoes, I'm sure you guys have all seen the crazy guy who runs with no shirt and like tight shorts on with no shoes on whatsoever in the park. There's definitely some strange guys out there. The Born to Run book was fabulous. It was a great read. I recommend reading it to anybody who hasn't. It's very fun. It's very interesting, and the characters are in it are amazing. But the truth is that most of the scientific, quote unquote, recommendations and analysis that he did are pretty limited. None of it's really based on any hard science. It's all based on a lot of anecdotal stuff. And I think if you're an Indian in Mexico and you grew up walking and running on trails, then probably you don't need regular running shoes. But most of us are not running on trails in Mexico. Most of us are running in Central Park, which is either dirt, or crashed asphalt, or hard-packed, hard-packed surfaces, which I just don't think are the same. And so I think to say that human beings are really, it's natural for them to run in minimalist running shoes, to me, I don't think makes much sense. So I'm very sort of like a basic, I run in standard running shoes. I have, I guess, 3 pairs of running shoes I run in. I have a pair of Asics, I think it's gel Kayanos are the ones I use, which are there sort of like pretty medium stability, sort of firm shoe. It's just a very sort of solid, thick, pretty heavy running shoe that I do for 90% of my training. I have a pair of pretty lightweight speed shoes that I use for running long runs and races. I'm using for races and anything from marathon, half marathon. And then I've got some crazy super light ones that I'll run a 5K or 10K in that feel like I'm barely wearing anything, and my feet are always sore after running them, but they're super light, so if I'm running a short race, it's helpful. So that's, to me, I think minimalist shoes are good for minimalist runs. If you want to run really fast in light shoes, I think it can help your speed. But I don't think it's really, sort of helpful for everybody to do that, and I think it's definitely asking for trouble. I do see a lot of patients come in when I'll ask them to send the question, oh, what kind of running shoes do you run in? And they'll look at me kind of sheepishly and they'll say, well, I've been experimenting with a couple different things and that. And I'll say, let me guess, you've been trying something really minimalist. And they say, yeah, it's kind of how it started. I was doing fine until I started in those shoes, and now they're really killing me. And and I've seen a bunch of stress fractures that came from those Vibram 5-finger shoes. I'm kind of glad to see that. I don't see as many of those out in the last 2 years as I did even 2 or 3 years ago, because I did see a bunch of people with stress fractures from those, and I think those are sort of on the dangerous side. But there's a lot of other running shoe companies that have sort of more minimalist shoes, which I think may not be so unreasonable for everybody. But to me, I think that we run on mostly asphalt and hard packed dirt. To me, running shoes are designed for that. That's what is helpful. So that's my own personal view on it. Yes.
Is there such thing, can you overuse those, topical, gel things? Because, I like this one called BioFreeze. I'm afraid I'm using it too often. Is it bad?
Well, BioFreeze is not a medication. It doesn't have a active ingredient like Voltaren or the Flector patches, which deeply penetrates and gets into the muscle and actually does something biologic. BioFreeze is basically a compound like Bengay or any of these other compounds that acts to promote sort of like more aggressive evaporation on your skin, which makes it feel cool. That's what makes coolness is evaporation creates that. As the water comes off your skin, it basically takes heat out of it. So it's basically similar to icing it down. I don't actually use it, most of that stuff, just because I think it's kind of messy and smelly, and I don't really love it. For me, I just grab an ice pack out of the fridge and wrap it with an ace wrap around the body part if I feel like it needs it. But that's not because I'm opposed to it, and I don't think you can really overuse that kind of stuff.
I use it every day. I'm addicted to it.
Yeah.
Are you using it before your runs or after?
After.
Yeah, I think, you definitely want to use them after runs. Before runs, it's not going to really do much. It's just going to get warmed up. The one thing I would warn you about that I learned about the hard way is there's a stuff called capsaicin cream out there, which is it's a hot pepper cream that is good for like back muscle issues. It's good for muscles that are really sort of overstimulated. It's good for sore muscles, and it's not a bad technique. The one thing that you should never do with it, which I learned the hard way when one of the reps gave me a sample of some stuff to try, is that never put it on before a run. It is a recipe for extreme horrible pain. You put the stuff on. I put it on I guess a knee that was sore. Went out for a run, and like about 5 minutes into the run, I thought, wow, this is really warming up. This feels great. About 10 minutes into the run, I said, wow, this really hurts. 15 minutes into the run, I said, holy crap, I can't believe this hurts so much. And washed it off, but it still burns like hell. So capsaicin cream, they should put a big note on it. Do not use before exercise, because it really can be pretty bad stuff. So that's the one cream I would say definitely avoid using for runners for the most part, especially before a run or any other exercise activity. But most of these other creams, the BioFreeze stuff or arnica gel and things like that, they're pretty benign. I don't think you are going to do much harm with that. But yes.
What do you think of that tape? You've seen a lot of athletes.
Yeah.
Kinesio
The
tape.
Kinesio tape, yeah. A bunch
Yeah.
of companies, Rock Tape makes it. There's a bunch of different companies out there. They're very colorful and cool looking, and if they're applied properly, they really look cool. I personally don't think a whole lot of them. I've had some therapists that have tried to take me down in different areas to see what they would do. I've never been super impressed by it. I do think that the one area that seems to respond to it pretty well is the patellofemoral joints. So people who have the runner's knee or patellofemoral pain, tape properly applied by somebody who knows what they're doing can suddenly pull the kneecap over a little bit better than a brace or some other device can do. And it can sort of like get your knee used to the idea that this is how it's supposed to track, so it can kind of retrain it a little bit. So I'm not opposed to the stuff. I just don't think it works for a lot of things, and I do think that if it's not applied properly, then it's useless. And I think it's not easy to apply. I tried applying it to a couple of body parts of mine and found that I was like, okay, I don't know what I'm doing. Even though the therapist showing me where to put it on, I still felt like it really wasn't that useful. So I think if it's put on by a physical therapist and it's done with an intention of trying to do one, address one specific part, I think it's probably not a bad thing to do. I don't think it has any advantage in training or racing or improving performance or anything else. You definitely, if you look at the beginnings of the New York City Marathon or any of these other races, if you take the first, let's say the first 1,000 runners, and then take 1,000 runners from the middle, and the first 1,000 runners, you see very few braces on their knees, you see very few taping, you see very few people with funky running shoes like Vibrant Five Fingers things and stuff like that. And you pretty much see guys wearing standard running shoes with standard running outfits, and that's pretty much most of what you see. Further back in the pack, you see a lot of crazy contraptions that people have tried. Most of them have never been to a doctor to address their problem. They just looked up on the internet and put some crazy brace on their knee that they're running 26 miles in, which I think is nuts. Or they've taped themselves up in some funky fashion with those wrapped all around. I think if you've got good support and somebody knows what they're doing, then most of the time you don't need a lot of that stuff. But again, under the guidance of a therapist, even some racing can be helpful sometimes.
We'll take one more with the doctor.
Yep.
I have two in one.
Oh,
Oh,
okay.
It's about
Snuck one in.
recovery actually after a long run.
I'm sorry, say again?
About recovery after long run.
Yep.
You mentioned like a long run, you have the race here and there, so do I. Not much, but I think that from the long run, my question number one is, what do you think, especially after long run, taking Advil before you sleep after long run? And the question number two, what do you think about the compression socks for recovery?
Okay, well, I'll address both. As far as recovery, I'll tell you my routine for recovering from long runs, which I just started on Saturday after a nice long training run. I do take a cold shower, which I think is helpful. I think if you can, stomach it, you start off with a warm shower and then try to really drop the temperature down and then put the spray down more on my legs. I think that can be helpful. And I do some light stretches, especially for hamstrings afterwards. Nutrition after long runs, you guys will probably address that at some point. There have been a bunch of studies, I don't know how good they are, but I think it's commonly done and it's commonly practiced, is to get a decent amount of carbohydrates and protein in right after a run, and it should be relatively digestible stuff, so either like some type of a shake or milk. I usually drink just like a big thing of chocolate milk afterwards and then eat like a Cliff Bar or something like that. There's all kinds of crazy powders and things like that, but I do believe getting a pretty good amount of carbohydrates and protein in right after a long run is supposedly good for your it's good for training. It's supposed to make you basically building things up stronger for later runs and races. As far as Advil goes, anti-inflammatories, I personally am not a big fan of using them sort of prophylactically to try to get rid of inflammation to sort of prevent injuries. I don't think there's any study that proves that really is of any use. And I do think that some inflammation is natural. The body is supposed to produce inflammation. That inflammation heals things. You need inflammation to heal stuff. But in general, for an injury, the body tends to go overboard and produce too much of it. So I do like anti-inflammatories for treatment of different disorders, but I have a whole box of all different anti-inflammatories sitting in my closet, but I really don't bring them out during running season unless I've got something that I think really needs addressing. So I'm a little more of a minimalist for that. I don't really think it's a great idea. I don't know if there's a study proving that it's bad, but I don't think it sort of makes sense to me to do that on a prophylactic basis. There also is some question about using these things before runs. There's been some studies that show that long distance running events, you can get hyponatremia, which is where you get sodium imbalances that can occur with taking these anti-inflammatories. I think think it's kind of anecdotal. Personally, have I taken some anti-inflammatories before races where I thought I might need some, where I had a problem? I've used them from time to time. I think there may be some risk associated with it, but it's probably pretty minimal if you have normal kidney function. But at the races, we don't give out anti-inflammatories at all during the races or immediately afterwards. You won't find them on the course. You can get a Tylenol at mile 15 if you stop at a medical tent, but they won't give you an Advil, just for that reason that there is some study that shows that it might give some risk. So I think they're helpful, but I don't overuse them for sure, and I don't use them prophylactically. As far as the compression socks goes, there's some runners that like them. I don't think they're any. I don't think they're preventative of injuries. I don't think that they are going to help you. I think that if it's really cold outside, then maybe there might be some value in using those to keep your calves warm, to keep them sort of supple and limber. I tried them somewhat after recovering from a calf injury and felt they were kind of lackluster. It seemed like it helped me a little bit. Maybe made the calf feel a little better as I got back into running, but I wasn't so impressed. I tell you what I did do for the first time before I ran Berlin last year is I got some of those running calf compression socks that were super tight and wore them on the airplane trip over there, and that I thought was fantastic. When I got off the plane, legs felt great. Walking around Berlin the day before the race, I felt things felt really nice. So that's something I'm pretty religious about. I don't think I'll do it for Chicago since it's a 2-hour flight, but I think if you're going to take a long plane flight or a long car ride or something before a race, I do think the compression socks are pretty good if you know your legs are going to be sort of dangling down for a long period of time. So that's kind of when I've used it.
I think we have some takeaway points tonight as we get into our long runs. This is what I want you to take away and remember. Always keep a recovery day. It's really important, as the doctor said. As we get into the long runs, take them slowly. We don't want heroes. We don't want to say, oh, I did 14, I think I'll go for 16. Or I'm in 10-minute pace, but I'm feeling really frisky, I'm going to cut it down. This is not the time to do that. Keep up with the strength training and the core workouts, and that will hopefully avoid a lot of the aches and pains because your body will be strong enough to handle the mileage. So that's what I want you to remember. Anything you would add to that?
No, I think that's most it. And again, I don't want to make people paranoid and every little ache and pain think you got to rush to the doctor. A lot of stuff works itself out. A lot of stuff, it hurts, and then a week later you realize that it's gone away. But things that are sticking around, things that are making you miss more than 1 or 2 runs. Oftentimes it's good to get those things looked at early on because sometimes we can do things more aggressively at the beginning than after you've already missed 3 weeks of training, and then all of a sudden you're way behind. So
We don't want that.
I think in general things that are, if you need to take a couple of days off, take it a couple of days off and then go back to it and see how it goes. But if it's really sticking around more than a few days of rest that you need, then probably ought to have something to look at it to be sure that it's not something that could be treated more aggressively early to get you back in the game.
Yeah, we can recommend physical therapy, we can recommend doctors, certainly Dr. Rosen. So, but you are all going to be smart runners and you will not need that. So, thank you for coming.
Thank you.